The war in Europe was over, but for millions, the true struggle had just begun. Displaced, broken, and starving, they wandered through the rubble of a continent they no longer recognized. Among them were the women of the Third Reich, once lauded as the mothers and homemakers of a 1,000-year empire, now reduced to prisoners of war. Their camps were grim, their future uncertain. They faced a victor's justice and a world that saw them as complicit architects of unimaginable evil. As Allied forces swept through the crumbling Reich, a single decisive moment would challenge every assumption held about these women. A powerful American general, weary from a brutal war, stood before them with a simple proposition, an offer of freedom. But what he heard next from these defeated, forgotten women would not be a plea for release. It would be a demand that stunned him to his core, a choice that defied all logic, and a refusal that would echo through the annals of history. The air was thick with the dust of destruction, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything in the remains of a once proud nation. It was May 1945, and the sound of gunfire had finally faded, replaced by the low, mournful rumble of American military trucks moving through the shattered landscape of Germany. For Captain Thomas Miller, a 27-year-old intelligence officer from Ohio, the end of the war was less a victory than a numbing exhaustion. He and his platoon were tasked with the grim duty of processing prisoners of war, a relentless tide of humanity pouring out of the collapsing Reich. Among them were not just soldiers and SS officers, but also civilians and increasingly women. They were held in a makeshift camp on the outskirts of Nuremberg, a collection of canvas tents and barbed wire surrounding a derelict factory. The camp's name was simply K-12, and it held a unique and deeply unsettling population. Thousands of German women who had served in various capacities, from administrative roles in government ministries to auxiliary positions in the Wehrmacht. Captain Miller was a pragmatic man. He saw his mission as a matter of logistics and security. The women were a liability, a drain on limited resources, a potential security risk, and a moral quandary. The official policy from above was unclear, a bureaucratic mess of competing directives. Were they to be treated as civilians, as prisoners of war, as potential war criminals? The line was blurred, and Miller's orders were to hold them until a more concrete plan could be devised. But the human reality of the situation was far more complex. He spent his days walking the perimeter, the faces of the women a constant, haunting procession. There was a young nurse, no older than 18, who had worked in a military hospital. A stern-faced woman in her 50s who had been a functionary in the Nazi Women's League. And a frail-looking girl with haunted eyes who, he suspected, had been part of some youth auxiliary. They were all different, yet their shared fate had forged them into a single, silent body. The arrival of General Mark L. Miller, a four-star general known for his decisive, no-nonsense leadership, changed everything. The general, a man whose weary eyes held the weight of a continent's suffering, came not to inspect the camp, but to make a decision. He had seen the concentration camps, the emaciated victims, the unspeakable cruelty of the Nazi regime. He saw the German women in the K-12 camp not as innocent bystanders, but as the quiet cogs in a monstrous machine. They had been part of the system that had enabled the horrors he had witnessed. His first inclination was to be harsh, to treat them with the same cold justice they had shown their victims. But as he walked through the camp, an unexpected unease began to settle over him. He saw women clutching tattered photographs of children, their faces etched with a profound despair. He saw others huddled together, sharing meager rations, their conversation a low, murmuring hum of survival. This wasn't a group of zealous fanatics he had expected to find. This was a collection of broken human beings, a grim mirror reflecting the total collapse of their society. General Miller's directive was to consolidate and process, but his personal feelings were in turmoil. He called a meeting with his staff, including Captain Miller. "These women are a problem, Captain," the general said, his voice low and gravelly. "They're a drain on our resources. We need to figure out what to do with them. A mass release is out of the question. We don't know who among them might be a genuine threat. A prolonged detention is unsustainable." The captain listened, but he had no answers. He had been so focused on the logistics that he had ignored the human element. The general, however, had a flash of inspiration, a bold and unorthodox idea. It was a strategy born from desperation and a deep-seated belief in a certain American pragmatism. He would go to the heart of the matter and offer them a choice. He would address them directly. He ordered his staff to gather every woman in the camp the next morning. It was a risky move, bypassing standard procedure, but the general felt it was the only way to get a clear picture of what he was dealing with. He needed to hear their voices, to look into their eyes, to understand the true nature of their predicament. The women were told to assemble in the main square of the camp, a patch of muddy, flattened earth between the tents. The air was cold and damp, a persistent drizzle falling from a slate-gray sky. They stood in rigid, silent rows, their faces turned toward a makeshift platform where General Miller and his staff stood. The general looked out at the sea of faces, a silent multitude of defeated humanity. He saw suspicion, fear, and an impenetrable wall of defiance. This was his moment to act, to impose his will and solve this problem once and for all. He raised his hand, and the low murmur of the crowd died away. A profound silence descended, broken only by the sound of the rain. "I am General Miller," he began, his voice a commanding rumble that carried across the square. "You are prisoners of war. The war is over. Your country has been defeated. I am here to offer you a choice." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the minds of the women. He had come to them with what he believed was an act of mercy, a way out of their grim situation. He expected to see relief, gratitude, and a wave of eager acceptance. What he saw was a collective tightening of their features, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place, a mixture of distrust and something more profound, more unsettling. The choice he was about to present was simple, yet it would unleash a torrent of reactions that he could not have possibly foreseen. His words hung in the air, a promise of freedom that was about to be met with an entirely unexpected response. The silence held, pregnant with the weight of history and the future of thousands of lives. The general's words hung in the cold, damp air, a beacon of hope in a sea of despair. "I am offering you freedom," he repeated, his voice softened slightly, a hint of genuine compassion breaking through his military reserve. "Those of you who have not been directly accused of war crimes will be released. You will be given passes to return to your homes, to your families. The war is over. You are free!" A ripple of murmurs, hushed and disbelieving, swept through the assembled women. Some stared at him, their expressions a mixture of shock and suspicion. Others exchanged quick, nervous glances, as if afraid to believe what they were hearing. For months, they had lived in a limbo of uncertainty, their existence defined by the rhythm of the camp, the bugle call in the morning, the bland rations, the constant low-grade fear. Now this powerful American officer was offering a complete reversal of their fortunes. For a brief, fleeting moment, General Miller saw a flicker of the response he had anticipated, a wave of gratitude and relief. But as the murmurs subsided, something else took their place. A single, clear voice, speaking in perfect, unaccented English, cut through the silence. "And where are we to go, General?" The voice belonged to a tall, gaunt woman in her late 30s, her face marked by hardship, but her posture ramrod straight. She was Dr. Elizabeth Werner, a former medical assistant who had been in charge of a small civilian hospital in Berlin. Her question was simple, but its implications were profound. The general, taken aback, faltered for a second. "To your homes, of course," he said, a note of impatience creeping into his voice. "To your families. Your homes are waiting for you." Dr. Werner's lips curled into a bitter, humorless smile. "My home is a pile of rubble. My city, Berlin, is a cemetery. My family, I have no idea if they are alive or dead. And if they are alive, where are they? Displaced? Starving?" A chorus of voices rose, first a few, then a torrent. The general's well-intentioned offer was dissolving before his eyes. A woman yelled out that her village had been burned to the ground. Another cried out that her husband had been a soldier on the Eastern Front, and she hadn't heard from him in years. The dam had broken. The silence was replaced by a chaotic outpouring of grief, desperation, and a raw, bitter truth. The women were refusing freedom because they had nowhere to be free to. They were refugees in their own defeated country. The promise of release was, for most of them, a release into nothingness, into a landscape of shattered lives and unimaginable loss. The war had not just taken their country. It had taken their identities, their families, their sense of belonging. The camp, for all its misery, was a known quantity. It was a place of food, however meager, of shelter, however temporary, and of a grim kind of community. The world outside the barbed wire was a far more terrifying unknown. General Miller felt a cold shock of realization. He had seen the German people as a single, monolithic enemy. He had been so focused on the grand scale of the war, on the strategic and moral imperatives, that he had failed to see the individual tragedies that lay beneath the surface. He had offered them a gift, but in their eyes it was an empty box. He stepped down from the platform, walking toward Dr. Werner. Captain Miller watched from a distance, amazed at the general's unorthodox approach. General Miller stood before Dr. Werner, his posture no longer that of a commanding officer, but of a man genuinely trying to understand. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice low. "You would rather stay here?" Dr. Werner looked him directly in the eye. "General, we are safer here. We have food and shelter. We have a shared fate. We are not just prisoners of war. We are a community of survivors outside. Outside there is no law, no food, no protection. There are other displaced people, there are revenge killings, there is starvation. To let us go is to cast us out into a world that has no place for us. To stay here is to have a chance." Her words were a chilling indictment of the world the Allies had created in their victory. The swift, total defeat of the Third Reich had left a power vacuum, a moral and physical void that was being filled by chaos and desperation. The general's plan, a straightforward act of military protocol and mercy, had become an existential trap for the very people he sought to release. The truth of her words resonated with the other women. A low, unified murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. They were not refusing freedom out of some twisted sense of loyalty to the fallen regime or some stubborn defiance. They were refusing it out of a primal need for survival. The camp, once a symbol of their defeat, had become a refuge, a lifeboat in a turbulent sea. For the general, this was a moment of profound moral and tactical reevaluation. His war was over, but the aftermath was proving to be a new and unforeseen conflict, a humanitarian crisis of a scale he had never comprehended. He had been a conqueror, but he was now faced with the unexpected burden of a vanquished population who desperately needed him to be a caretaker. The very people he had sought to defeat were now looking to him for sanctuary, and their refusal of his gift was the first step in a long, complicated negotiation for their survival. The general stood there, surrounded by the silence of 1,000 determined women, and for the first time since the war began, he felt utterly without a clear path forward. The general returned to his headquarters, the women's collective refusal echoing in his mind. The camp's orderly, predictable management had just been thrown into chaos by an act of unexpected defiance. He had prepared for resistance, for pleas of innocence, for outbursts of anger, but not for a logical, cold-eyed refusal of his most generous offer. He sat at his makeshift desk, the maps and strategic documents of the war that had just ended now feeling like relics from a different lifetime. He called Captain Miller to his office. "What do we do now, Captain?" the general asked, his voice devoid of its usual authority. "They won't leave. We can't force them into a world where they will starve. It would be a crime. A different kind of crime, perhaps, but a crime nonetheless." Captain Miller, ever the pragmatist, offered a few logistical solutions: move them to another camp, try to find their families, process them individually, but he knew these were just band-aids on a gaping wound. The problem was not just logistical. It was deeply human and moral. The general's staff was split. Some argued for a hard line, that the women were simply trying to manipulate the American command. Others, including Captain Miller, were beginning to see the profound truth in Dr. Werner's words. The war had not ended cleanly with a surrender. It had unspooled into a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. The women in K-12 were a microcosm of this larger crisis. General Miller, however, was a man who did not shrink from a challenge. He decided on a new course of action, one that would be both a test of his own principles and a genuine attempt to address the women's concerns. He would not just feed them and shelter them. He would begin to rebuild from the inside out. He ordered his men to find building materials and tools. He would turn the camp from a detention center into a functioning community. It was a radical idea, a complete pivot from the typical treatment of enemy prisoners. His staff was incredulous, but the general's orders were absolute. The next few days were a blur of activity. American soldiers, who had spent the last few years fighting a deadly war, were now tasked with building wooden barracks, digging communal latrines, and setting up a makeshift kitchen. They were given specific instructions to be respectful, to treat the women not as prisoners, but as wards. The women, in turn, watched with a mixture of disbelief and guarded hope. They were no longer being simply held. They were being provided for. The most dramatic change came with the general's next move. He called for a meeting with Dr. Werner and a few other women who had emerged as leaders. He did not talk down to them. He listened. He asked them what they needed, what skills they had. Dr. Werner, speaking for the group, laid out a list of requests. They needed a medical clinic, however rudimentary. They needed a place to teach the younger women basic skills, to keep their minds engaged. They needed a way to clean their clothes, to maintain some semblance of dignity. The general agreed to every request. He gave Dr. Werner a small, dilapidated building to turn into a clinic. He provided her with whatever medical supplies his men could scrounge. He gave a former teacher, a quiet woman named Frau Schmidt, a tent to use as a makeshift school. He authorized the use of an old boiler to heat water for laundry. The women who had been living in a state of suspended animation now had a purpose. They were no longer just survivors. They were builders. They organized themselves with the same efficiency that had once been a hallmark of their society. They established a system for distributing food, for maintaining hygiene, for caring for the sick. The atmosphere in the camp began to change. The grim silence was replaced by the sound of hammers, of conversation, of low, hesitant laughter. Captain Miller watched this transformation with growing astonishment. He had seen the war's destruction, but he had not seen its human potential for rebirth. General Miller's decision, once so baffling, now seemed profoundly wise. He wasn't just managing a problem, he was cultivating a solution. He was using the resources of the victor to help the vanquished rebuild their lives. But there was a deeper purpose to his actions, one that he had yet to reveal. He was not just providing for them, he was preparing them. He was using the camp as a proving ground, a crucible for a new kind of social contract. He was creating a model for how to deal with the millions of other displaced people across Germany. He was showing that the American presence was not just about occupation and control, but also about humanitarian aid and reconstruction. He was building trust in a world where trust had been destroyed. But as the camp began to find its new rhythm, a new challenge loomed. The American command, hearing about the general's unorthodox methods, was beginning to ask questions. They saw the camp not as a solution, but as an unnecessary expenditure of resources and a dangerous precedent. The general was on a tightrope, and one misstep could lead to the dissolution of his entire plan and a return to the bleak, chaotic reality he had sought to avoid. Word of General Miller's unconventional approach to the K-12 camp spread through the Allied command. The reports arriving at the central headquarters in Frankfurt were met with skepticism, then with outright hostility. The prevailing sentiment was one of tough love. Germany had started the war. Let them deal with the consequences. The idea of using valuable resources, food, lumber, and most importantly, manpower to improve the living conditions of German women, prisoners seemed absurd. A dangerous overextension of the American mission. A high-ranking officer, Colonel Davies, was dispatched from headquarters to conduct an inspection of the camp, a thinly veiled investigation into General Miller's activities. Colonel Davies was a career officer, a man of rigid protocol and unbending logic. He saw the world in black and white, and General Miller's actions were, to him, a muddy, dangerous shade of gray. When Colonel Davies arrived, the camp was humming with an energy he hadn't expected. Instead of sullen, defeated women, he saw people working. He saw women in makeshift workshops, turning scraps of wood into stools and tables. He saw others tending a small garden plot, coaxing fragile seedlings from the hard-packed earth. He saw children, the daughters of some of the women, learning to read in a canvas schoolhouse. The camp was not just a prison. It was a nascent village. Colonel Davies, however, was not impressed. He saw it as a violation of regulations, a waste of resources that should be going to other Allied troops or to the millions of true victims of the war. He marched directly to General Miller's office, his face a mask of cold fury. "What is the meaning of this, General?" he demanded, slamming his fist on the desk. "You are running a country club for the enemy. Headquarters is not pleased. We are facing a critical shortage of supplies and you're building furniture for these people? What exactly is your objective here?" General Miller stood up, his gaze steady. "My objective, Colonel, is to prevent a humanitarian crisis of untold proportions. These women refused freedom because they would rather be here, with food and shelter, than out there, in a world that has no place for them. My objective is to give them a place, a purpose, and a chance to rebuild. My objective is to show them that we are not here to simply punish, but to help them stand on their own feet again. If we simply release them, they will become a burden on the occupied territories, a source of instability and a breeding ground for resentment. By helping them now, we are creating a more stable future for everyone." Davies scoffed. "And what about the other Germans? The millions of others who are suffering? What about them? Are we to do this for all of them?" "In time, Colonel," General Miller said, his voice low and firm. "In time. This is a model, a test. If we can create a self-sufficient community here, we can replicate it elsewhere. We can begin to show the German people that they can rebuild. But it must start somewhere. It must start with trust." Davies was unmoved. He saw only the immediate cost, the deviation from protocol, the potential for political fallout. He issued a direct order. "Cease all non-essential construction and humanitarian efforts immediately. Prepare for the mass release of all non-combatants. This camp will be dissolved in 1 week." He turned and walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. General Miller stood there, his vision on the verge of collapse. He had two choices: follow the order and undo all the progress he had made, or defy it and risk his career, maybe even a court-martial. He knew that the women, having tasted the promise of a future, would not accept being cast back out into the chaos. The trust he had so carefully built would be shattered. He called Captain Miller to his side. "Get Dr. Werner and the other leaders," he said, his voice a grim whisper. "Tell them what has happened. We need to prepare them for the worst." Captain Miller, his heart heavy, went to find Dr. Werner. He found her in the new makeshift clinic, meticulously cleaning instruments. He explained the situation, his words stumbling over the sheer injustice of it all. Dr. Werner listened, her face unreadable. She did not cry, did not express fear or anger. She simply nodded. "So the war is not over for us after all," she said quietly. "We are to be punished for surviving." Captain Miller had no answer. He stood in the clinic, surrounded by the signs of a community they had built with their own hands, and felt a profound sense of failure. He returned to the general, who was now staring at a map of Germany, a look of deep concentration on his face. He had made a decision. He was not going to follow Davies' order. He was going to resist it, but not with force or an open act of defiance. He was going to use the most powerful tool at his disposal, the very thing the women had given him in the first place. Their refusal. He would not just tell headquarters that the women refused to leave. He would show them in a way they could not ignore. He was preparing for a new kind of battle, one fought with wills and words, and he knew he had to win to save not only his career, but the lives of thousands. The fate of K-12 and perhaps the fate of the Allied humanitarian mission in Germany now hung in the balance. General Miller's defiance of Colonel Davies' order was a high-stakes gamble. He knew he could not simply ignore a direct command. Instead, he decided to play a different game. He sent a coded message to a trusted contact in the Army's public relations office, a man he had served with in North Africa. His message was concise and carefully worded, framing the situation not as a military insubordination, but as a compelling human interest story. He detailed the women's initial refusal of freedom, their logical reasons for doing so, and the subsequent successful effort to build a self-sufficient community. He highlighted the extraordinary cooperation between the American soldiers and the German women, portraying it as a symbol of hope and a model for future reconstruction. He understood the power of narrative. While military reports were designed for internal consumption, a well-crafted news story could bypass the chain of command and go straight to the American people and to a global audience. His gambit paid off. A few days later, a small group of American war correspondents and photographers arrived at K-12. Colonel Davies, who had expected Miller to be in a panic, was stunned. He watched, apoplectic, as General Miller, with the calm demeanor of a seasoned politician, took the journalists on a tour of the camp. They saw the makeshift schoolhouse, where children recited their letters in English and German. They saw the clinic, where Dr. Werner and her assistants tended to the sick and injured, their faces a portrait of quiet professionalism. They saw the women working in the garden, their hands in the soil, planting the seeds of a future. They saw the faces no longer sullen and defeated, but marked with a new sense of purpose and a faint, fragile hope. The photographers in particular were captivated. One image in particular would come to define the story, a stark, powerful photograph of General Miller standing side by side with Dr. Werner, his face etched with respect, her posture proud and defiant. The image was a powerful counter-narrative to the common portrayals of Germans as unrepentant villains. Here, in the ruins of the Reich, was a story of reconciliation and shared humanity. The stories from K-12 were a sensation. They appeared on the front pages of newspapers across the United States. The American public, weary of a brutal war and the grim reports of atrocities, responded with an outpouring of support. The story of the German women who chose to rebuild their lives rather than be cast into chaos resonated deeply. Politicians, feeling the pressure from their constituents, began to issue statements of support for General Miller's compassionate and forward-thinking approach. The political and public relations firestorm was more than Colonel Davies could handle. Headquarters, faced with the positive media coverage and the public's emotional response, could no longer simply shut down the operation. The narrative had shifted from one of military protocol to one of humanitarian necessity. Colonel Davies, defeated and humiliated, was recalled to Frankfurt. General Miller had won the first round, not through force, but through a masterful understanding of human nature and the power of a compelling story. But the victory was only temporary. The camp was now a symbol, a beacon of hope, but it was not a sustainable solution. The women could not stay in a temporary camp forever. They were still prisoners, still living a life of limbo. The general, knowing his time was limited, knew he had to find a permanent solution. He called a meeting with Dr. Werner and the other women leaders, and this time, the conversation was about their future, not just their present. The women had a plan, one that had been forged in the crucible of their shared experience. They wanted to turn K-12 into a permanent resettlement community. They proposed to take over the administration of the camp themselves, to work with the American authorities to find and process other displaced German civilians, and to help in the reconstruction efforts of nearby towns. They were, in essence, offering to become the Americans' partners in the rebuilding of Germany. It was a bold, audacious proposal, a complete inversion of the traditional roles of victor and vanquished. General Miller listened, his respect for the women deepening with every word. This was not a plea for charity. It was a demand for self-determination. They were not just asking for help. They were offering to help. He knew that their plan was a viable and elegant solution to the seemingly intractable problem of Germany's displaced population. But to make it happen, he would have to go even higher up the chain of command, all the way to General Eisenhower himself. He would have to risk everything on the belief that these women, once his enemies, were now the key to a peaceful future. The camp had become a symbol, but it was about to become something more profound, a blueprint for a nation's rebirth, forged in the ashes of defeat and a single, stunning refusal of freedom. The meeting with General Eisenhower was the culmination of General Miller's high-stakes gamble. He flew to the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force, carrying with him not just reports and data, but the weight of a powerful human story. He sat across from Eisenhower, a man whose decisions had shaped the course of the war and now held the fate of a continent in his hands. General Miller laid out his case, starting with the initial shocking refusal of the German women to accept freedom. He then detailed the transformation of K-12 from a grim detention camp into a thriving, self-governing community. He spoke of Dr. Werner and the other women leaders, their remarkable resilience and their bold vision for the future. He presented their proposal not as a request, but as a partnership. Eisenhower listened, his face a study in a concentration. He was a man who understood grand strategy and the complexities of nation-building. He had seen the chaos on the ground and knew that the Allies could not simply rebuild Germany on their own. They needed to empower the German people to do it themselves. Miller's story of K-12 was a powerful example of that very principle in action. "So you're telling me," Eisenhower said, leaning forward, "that these women, who we defeated in battle, are now offering to help us rebuild their country?" General Miller nodded. "They are, sir. They have a shared purpose, a sense of community, and the skills to make it happen. They are not asking for handouts. They are asking for a chance to contribute." Eisenhower was silent for a long moment, the air thick with the weight of the decision. He looked at the reports, then at General Miller. He had to be sure this wasn't a fluke, a localized anomaly. He had to believe that this model could be replicated on a massive scale. He gave Miller his answer, not in words, but with a simple, decisive nod. "I want you to make it happen," Eisenhower said. "Not just here, but across the American zone. Take this model, this community, and use it as a blueprint. Give these women the resources and the autonomy they need to succeed, and I want you to report directly to me on their progress." General Miller felt a surge of relief and vindication. The general's faith in him was a testament not only to his own vision, but to the extraordinary humanity of the women of K-12. He had been given the green light to implement his plan on a scale that would change the course of post-war Germany. Returning to K-12, he assembled the women and delivered the news. The camp was no longer a temporary holding facility. It was to become the Nuremberg Resettlement Center, a permanent community dedicated to helping displaced Germans find their way back into society. The women, under the leadership of Dr. Werner, would be in charge of the center's operations, working in close collaboration with the American military. The news was met with a stunned silence, then with a wave of emotion. The women, who had once been broken and defeated, were now filled with a sense of purpose and a shared destiny. They began to work not just for survival, but for a future, for their country. The center became a hub of activity. They processed other refugees, established a vocational training program, and helped reconnect families who had been separated by the war. The center became a symbol of a new Germany, one built on the principles of resilience, cooperation, and a fierce determination to rebuild from the ground up. Captain Miller, who had seen the camp in its darkest days, watched the transformation with a profound sense of awe. The women who had once refused his general's offer of freedom were now its greatest architects. They were no longer the passive victims of history. They were its active participants. The camp, once a symbol of their defeat, had become a crucible of their rebirth. The story of K-12 became a legend, a quiet but powerful testament to the fact that even in the face of unimaginable devastation, the human spirit, when given the chance, will always choose to build, to heal, and to hope. But the story of the German women and their choice was not just a tale of triumph. It was a powerful reminder that the end of one war often marks the beginning of another, more subtle conflict, one fought not with weapons, but with the fragile threads of trust, humanity, and forgiveness. And as the Nuremberg Resettlement Center began its work, the women looked toward a new, uncertain horizon, knowing that their greatest test was yet to come. The future of a nation and their place in it was now entirely in their own hands.